Welcome everyone to the 24th annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the world's largest and oldest Jewish cultural arts events. On behalf of the organizers, I want to thank all the festival members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all you film lovers, and especially the presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, also known as SAGE, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support of this festival throughout all these years. And welcome to you, the viewers. Thank you for joining us for this post-viewing interview. My name is Peter Nelson, and I'll be interviewing director Benjamin Fischerman, whose film My War-Torn Family premiered at this year's festival. Now, briefly, let me introduce myself. I'm an educator, and for 24 years, I directed the New York office of Facing History and Ourselves, an educational nonprofit whose primary case study is the Holocaust. I actually facilitated some workshops at a SAGE conference during that time. I'm also connected to this subject because my parents were both Holocaust survivors or refugees. My mother and her family left Berlin at the last moment, really, April 1939, and thankfully for me as well as for them, I wouldn't be alive if not for this, were allowed into the United States. My father, also a Berliner, had to leave Berlin as the Nazis took over, and he and his family went to Amsterdam and lived there again under the nose of the Nazi occupiers once they invaded. In fact, he and his parents lived on the same street as Anne Frank, although they never knew that. One last connection, my father also married a woman in Amsterdam. She happened to be, she was Jewish. He was actually what's called a Mischlinge. He was part Jewish, part Christian because of his different religion parents. But she then was picked up as a Jew and sent to Ravensbrück, a concentration camp on the outskirts of Berlin. From there, and this is the connection, she was rescued by the Red Cross and given refuge in Sweden. When she returned, my father and she officially married, but she had been in a concentration camp. She was no longer the woman he had loved, but a different person, and they divorced shortly after. So I too have tried to understand my so-called war-torn family. And now to Benjamin Fischerman and his remarkable film. Hi, Benjamin.
Hi, Peter. Nice to be here.
Good to meet you. Good to have had the opportunity to see your film. I want to thank you for making this painfully revealing film. And I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. I want to ask, are you a filmmaker who made a film about his family, or are you a family member who chose to learn about them by making a film? Basically, who are you?
I think I would say both, for sure. Because I think if I wouldn't have been a filmmaker, I wouldn't have had that distance to it. And if I hadn't been a family member, I wouldn't have had the personal motivation to do it. So I guess I'm both.
You're both, wonderful. And are you making more films in the future, or?
Yeah, for sure. I think I definitely needed a break after this one because it took me 4 years in total to make the film, and was kind of a long experience.
I can imagine. We feel like we've gone on this journey with you. It's phenomenal. Did have your family members seen the film? And
yeah. It had a premiere.
And what can you say? What their reaction was?
It was great. Like, I think it gave them some sort of peace, for sure, and understanding, because I think maybe it's something you don't think about when you watch it, is that when Robert or Sally and so on, when they see the film, this is actually the first time they get an explanation.
Yeah. And that's your search. I want to ask you very much about this, one way in which one can see this film. But before I do, I think maybe just for the viewers, just even though they may have just seen the film, I'm wondering if you could just recapitulate a little bit of that moment when the Nazis raid the house and the family goes in two different directions. Do you mind doing that?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, there had been rumors in the Jewish Copenhagen society about that the Nazis were coming to deport the Danish Jews. But these rumors came quite late to my family. And they were quite unsure, actually, if it was true. So to be on the safe side, they've heard that they would only take grown children, like adult children, and the men, the fathers of the families. So to be sure, they had sent the two oldest siblings to other addresses. And then they were home that night when they knocked on the door, the Nazis, and they thought the family and the siblings who were home, They were only after taking the father. So that's why he flees down from through the window and down, and he escapes. And then he meets up with the two older siblings, like the two eldest children, and they try to flee to Sweden.
Did they also go down the sheets that are tied together, or how did they
no,
get out?
No, they actually it's unclear whether how he knew where his children were. They just knew they were at other addresses. So for some reason he managed to meet up with them.
I got it.
And then they try to flee over Sweden, and it turns out the boat is rotten and it goes down. And unfortunately, Ante and Leopold doesn't survive. And then Fanny wakes up, and she later finds out that actually, to her surprise, the rest of the family was sent to Theresienstadt, the concentration camp. So you have like these two things going on at the same time.
And then she takes a second boat eventually to Sweden. Is that how she gets to Sweden?
Yeah, exactly. So she takes a second boat, and this time successful. Basically, I think she just wakes up at the hospital, and she was like, got this awful news, devastating news, but was told that but you have to get going as soon as possible because the Germans are here.
Yeah. And then the rest of the family ends up on the train to Theresienstadt.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. So let's dive into the film a little bit. And I want to ask you this question. For you and through you, for us as an audience, one could describe the film as a detective story. The mystery is, why does your grandfather refuse to have anything to do with the siblings? Is it fair to characterize the film this way?
Yeah, for sure. It is a personal investigation. I would definitely say that. I think it's like I pose a question I really want to get an answer to. That's kind of like the whole thing in one line, exactly. Yeah.
And you want this because this is something you need to understand yourself and where you come from and how the family is interacting, or why is this question gripping you?
Well, I think first of all, I'm quite a curious person, and I think you need to be that as a filmmaker. I'm always been like very curious, and I think there has been this thing in the family. There's this trauma, this uncleared thing that has always just been in the family, but they never really talked about it. So I thought that would be maybe also I could personally gain something by exploring that. So I think like, yeah, I really wanted like an answer to that, and also to get my grandfather has always been kind of also a mystery in a sense. So I really wanted to get to know him better, which has also been one of the really positive things, is to, really get to know not only talk to your grandparents, but actually ask the questions you never would ask. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned that many don't ever really get to know their grandparent, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Could I ask you about language, especially in the title? The title is My War-Torn Family. Is it war that tore them apart? They're not combatants. They have no weapons. They're not fighting anybody. Why do you call it My War-Torn Family?
Well, that's a hard one, because I think, so the Danish title is Krigen, der splittede min familie, which means the war that split my family. And I think my idea was that I didn't want to be in the position to say that it was because of the Second World War in itself that did this, because it's the repercussions of it. It's what happens to a family after, it's basically, I always describe this film as a Holocaust film that's not really about the Holocaust, in a sense, because it's about what happens the day they arrive in Denmark. So I think for me it was, it's about the war, the conflict in the family.
Yeah. It did strike me though, in a way, although I think this title is, I don't know about more attractive, but it sounds better, but it's all, in some ways, you're right. It's the post-trauma, post-battle that comes after, but it seems it's coming after the war against the Jews, if anything. It's the Holocaust. Yeah. But I think so much of the film is talking about the Holocaust. Maybe it didn't have to be so in your face in the title, and instead you say war. And it sounds like the Danish approach to this, that it's the repercussions of the war more so than the Holocaust. Maybe that's something Danish. It's interesting though, this, I have a question for you. You've answered it away, I guess, by saying that the family appreciated, or you feel came to peace to some extent, but your grandfather, Mogens, basically says, he says it is not wise to show this film to the family. He says,
Yeah.
have you thought about the consequences? So it sounds like you believe in the end it was a good choice, but did you debate this at all when he suggests that to you?
If I debated it with him?
No, with yourself. He's warning you. Be careful. Have you thought about the consequences?
Yeah, I did, definitely. That was like a battle I had with myself for the entire production of the film. Like when you work with family, I think the ethical dilemmas actually gets even bigger because you have such a big access. And I think I wouldn't know the answer to the question until I have made it and actually seen, well, what happened. And my experience was that actually all of them had a really profound, good experience with it because it really gave them some peace. It's basically like they have this confrontation that they never had in real life, you know?
Yeah.
So I think even though maybe they haven't, you know, changed opinions, they've changed, like, at least in terms of getting some peace.
Yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, it's interestingly paralleled a little bit with the decision by Fanny, because of the two priests who advise her this way, to not tell those in Theresienstadt that their mother and brother is no longer living. She keeps this from them. Do you see a similarity in the moral dilemma there? She chooses not to at the council of the priests, but she must be plagued with the same dilemma. Should I tell them? Should I not tell them? And of course, they're shocked then when they find it out and when they finally get to Sweden.
Yeah, if there's a similarity to
Yeah.
what I
Yeah,
I guess so. Like, I think from Fanny's point of view at that time, she was told to not tell, like, because maybe they wouldn't have survived. Like, there's so much about like the psychological things about it, right? So yeah, definitely. And I think it's actually a pattern that continues after, and that's actually what I'm trying to kind of break, in a sense. I'm trying to break the silence, because it also manifests itself in general conflicts. You know, if things get too rough or too hard to talk about, we just don't talk about it.
You're right. It's also time and place. Is there a time you don't tell someone horrible news if they're already in a desperate situation? Many Jews who survived the Holocaust actually did so thinking there was a family member they would survive for. And so here they think somewhere out there is our father and one of our brothers. It's fascinating. So, I mean, the heart of the film seems to be this tension between your grandfather and Robert. Sally just has found a way to move on. Fanny is just happy and delirious, obviously, to see your grandfather finally, even if it's late. But the central tension seems to be between Robert and Monis. Is it really mostly about that dynamic? Is that do you feel that's this critical center?
It
affects everyone, in effect.
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is definitely yes. I think that's the core of the conflict, and yeah, I don't know how it would have been if it wasn't for those two, you know. But I definitely think that's like the core of the conflict, mainly because I think, you know, maybe their relationship is the one that was most expressive in terms of, you know, Robert having a father role, and, you know, Mogens being the youngest, the kid in the family, right?
I mean, if one thinks about what you chart through this story, what Mogens goes through, I finally just decided, let me write this down. He's 5 years old. The world's at war. Along with part of the family, he's rounded up and put on a hellish train ride. They end up in a concentration camp where people are dying. I mean, people did die at Theresienstadt, and then others are sent off to who knows where, and they could be one of those people. They're there for a year and a half and then rescued by a bus from the combination Danish and Swedish, maybe Red Cross or organizations. And then they drive right past Denmark. They go past Denmark and end up quarantined for months in Sweden. And there they then he finds out, I want to put this more in Monis's point of view. He finds out his father and one of his brothers is dead, which they never knew. And then shortly thereafter, first they hear the mother blame Fanny for that. And then on top of it, Robert has to save their mother from committing suicide when they're back in Denmark. Is it hard to imagine why Monis would want to have nothing to do with anything from this period?
Yeah, I completely agree. And the thing that's also sets him apart from the West is, he doesn't have any happy memories from that family.
Yeah.
Like, at least the rest of the family have good memories of a family that was connected, So he grows up with a trauma he can't even remember. He can't remember today's instead. So I can't imagine how tough that must be, So
Yeah.
it's hard to
And,
put yourself
and,
there.
and I actually left out the death, obviously, of the sister who he actually had been closest to, at least in Sweden. They see, at least you picture it as though the two of them are together more than with others because they're the two youngest, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Rebecca, yeah. And then he has to live through the fact that she dies as well in Philadelphia.
Exactly, yeah.
It's unbelievable how any one of these are traumatic enough for someone to have a reaction to them. I want to return to this theme of this tension between Robert and the family's tension in general, but between the family and your grandfather. But first, if I could ask about Robert for a second, because Robert seems to have an interesting trait. He goes to Israel and he basically goes there, but is given up on his religious connection to Judaism and on God, most importantly or critically. And he blames the Danes for why he's gone to Israel because they couldn't protect the family, although he admits, what could they do? The Nazis were a blitzkrieg machine and the government could possibly stand up to them. But my question for you is actually a little bit personal. Having said that, the Danes have one of the most heroic resistance stories in the whole story of the Holocaust. They ferry almost the entire 7,000 of the 7,800 or so Danish Jews are sent to safety in neighboring Sweden, thanks to the courage of ferry boatmen who avoid the mines that could have also capsized the rowboat, but it's faulty built, how it was constructed. Did you ever learn the story of the Danish rescue in school in Denmark?
Yeah, it's definitely part. Yeah, it's part of like the what's called in English, like the curriculum, or the things we have to be taught. Yeah, so Danish people grow up with this, getting told the story. Yeah, for sure.
It's funny, this must be a change because I once talked to the Danish consul general and he said, no, we can't teach that because that would be immodest. And Danes are very modest. It would sound like we're bragging about ourselves. And I said, oh my gosh, how can you not tell this story? It's such an important story.
Yeah, that's a very Danish thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's like, fascinating.
Yeah, modesty, and like we have something called the janteloven, which basically means like, keep it to yourself. You don't go out and brag out.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like a form of social conduct. Yeah,
keep it to yourself seems to be a theme. But again, the family that Robert is part of is again saved by this cooperation between the Danes and the Swedes. And the outrage that the Danes have been sent to Theresienstadt, which was more supposed to be for Czech Jews. So they're actually saved by a country that Robert at least seems to disown it a little bit, or not disown, he's understanding.
No, yeah, he's basically, he calls it's not an accusation, just like he just didn't feel like it was possible and he still didn't feel safe. And I think he expresses in the film as well, like that he thinks there's a chance that it could happen again. So I guess that's one of the main reasons. Yeah.
Right. And there's an old phrase that for a Jew, at least, better to die on my feet in Israel than to live on my knees somewhere else. So there is this sense that you have protection, that if you die, you won't die, at least by your government failing to protect you as a Jew. It could be obviously for other reasons. Let's go back then to this dynamic, and the word blame comes all up a lot. I blame you, you blame me. The accusations go back and forth so much. Who is to blame for this condition of the family?
Yeah, well, my own view, and I think, the whole film is obviously also like, even though I try to be as objective as I can, the whole film is also like a statement, obviously, from my side. And I think what I've come to is that I don't think there's anyone who's like, you can blame for the whole thing. I think they're all like right and wrong at the same time, in a sense, I can understand all of the point of views. So I think there's really no like right or wrong where the blame is. Really, I think it's so hard to pass judgments when you think of what they've been through. So yeah, so it's that's one of the things that's really hard also when you're like in the edit and you have to edit the stories to kind of like make the story so balanced so you get everyone to tell their story, right? And through that edit I really realized that, you know, you can't really put the blame anywhere, because I think what really made the family collapse is when they arrived in Denmark and get told, you know, the father and the brother is gone, and then the mother has to pick up that responsibility, and she's not in the state to be able to do that, and that's where the whole constellation starts. That just doesn't work, right?
As a viewer, it's tragic. It's tragic because you watch two people. We've outlined how your grandfather went through trauma after trauma, but simultaneously, Robert isn't immune to any of that. He's also gone through all this, and yet all of the responsibility now sits on his shoulders. And he clearly doesn't do what Monis needs. Monis has accusations that you can understand towards him for not giving him something Robert was having trouble finding from anybody, which was love. But at the same time, if not for Robert, the family doesn't, he goes as the parents' teacher's night at the school. He's taking care of the mother by saving her from the gas. I mean, Robert is seemingly so, you know, when does it end? All the things I have to do. I'm also a victim of this. And yet I have to keep everything together. And he feels now that he's blamed for not doing enough, not being the father, perhaps. Why isn't the you know, it's not unusual that the one to blame is the one not there. And that's certainly not your father. It's somebody called the Nazis. Aren't they to blame for all this? This is the continuing legacy of the Holocaust. For sure.
I think that's like, it's like if you had to put blame, it's obviously there for sure. But I just think like when stuff like this happens to a family, I think, you know, the family feud just starts, and that's why they start to point their finger. Because like, I don't know, my grandfather, he also makes the point, I don't think it's in the film actually, that it could also be something else that had happened that made this constellation worse. So I just think, sorry, I don't know how to answer that actually. It's a hard,
You know, I know you struggle to begin with in the film trying to find these answers. The family says, I don't know why he doesn't want to talk to us. And I think, you know, I'll get to this later, but I mean, all of us don't know why either. Anybody who knows about this history or has any connection to it, and all the historians, they think they know why, they don't know why. This is very impossible to understand because there are so many actors, and as usual, the primary suspect is absent. The Nazis aren't present in any of these families except as ghosts and as horrible memories. And the goal is to chase them out of the memory. And if you do that, you've chased the actual culprit, you've chased the actual perpetrator. And so you look around. I mean, this is reminiscent of Fanny being blamed by her mother for the death of her mother's husband and son.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was one of the main like things I think was like that started also the whole thing, was that first initial where to put the blame. We had happened something so awful, and now the mother just needs something to hold on to, which is to blame Fanny, which is awful. I think that's where it really starts as well.
Yeah, it's not that unusual. You hear this sometimes in families where the father, in the United States at least, the father is left leaving the mother alone to raise the child. The child is angry that the father left, but the father's not there, so the child can't yell at the father, and the child yells and gives a hard time to the one who stayed to be the care provider. And for the one who looks on the outside, you think this is the most tragic thing in the world. The one who did the right thing is being blamed, and the one who did the wrong thing is not present.
Exactly.
And I think it feels that way. Let me go on with Robert one more time, just to talk about something that he also says in Israel during some of the filming you have of him that just struck me personally. And it also makes me wonder about a little bit the limits of his imagination, of his moral imagination. He can't understand your grandfather's decision to not want to have anything to do with the family. And it echoes a little bit when he makes the comment about the fanatical Jews. And I'm trying to wonder, who are these fanatical Jews? And they are Orthodox men who refuse to sit next to a woman on a bus. You've captured that in the film, which means he's never really wondered, it sounds to me, why they do that. There is something in the religion that requires this. It's not, and it's actually a respectful understanding, at least from the standpoint of somebody's Orthodox, but he doesn't seem that much to be interested in other people's point of views, which is a little unfair, again, given everything he's gone through. But
yeah, well, I think that's when we start into that kind of like main discussion where it's almost like confrontation in the film. I confront him with the fact, his thesis on my grandfather, that it's a feeling, it's an emotion, and we can't change that. I put that back to him, and he struggles quite hard to understand that, because well, if it is just a feeling, that's probably right, but maybe you also then have like a certain feeling that you can't put yourself out of imagining, right? So it goes both ways.
100%.
For sure.
Yeah, you mentioned there are mirrors in a way of each other, in a different direction, almost opposite mirrors, but they are doing so many things in tandem.
Yeah, like
the others doesn't see the other.
Exactly, and the mirror itself in like extremes, right? It's also with, like you see with Israel, like when they debate that, it's like the same.
It's very hard when there's so much at stake in a way that's so much about family.
Yeah, exactly.
Be it Israel or about, excuse me, about a literal family here. In the midst of your filming, you're given a sad, dramatic opportunity, which I'm imagining you didn't anticipate, that Fanny goes into a nursing home and your grandfather finally relents and decides, no, for this, I will go visit her. Were you surprised, even at that point of that news, that he decided to visit her? And let me leave it there first, and I have a follow-up.
Actually, no. I was pretty convinced that then he would see her, because he has his relationship to Fanny is so different from to the brothers. Like I think he has, even though maybe he doesn't say it, I do think he feels a bit bad about how he has neglected her in a sense, right? So I think definitely Fanny and the family is his soft spot. Sure. So I was pretty convinced, and like I think I would be heartbroken if he had said no, to be honest. But I wasn't surprised, actually. No, I was glad. I was very glad, obviously.
I can imagine. I mean, I mean, luckily you have a lot of it, but I felt at times you were ready to pull your hair out, and I thought maybe this was the one moment where you finally said, "Yes, I have a victory. Finally, something good has come of this.
Exactly.
I've broken the ice."
Exactly, and there's this point, where Fanny thanks me in the film, which was like such an amazing feeling. When you make film, I don't know, when you start out making film, you always think, I do this for myself because I want to express myself. So suddenly to add that dimension that you can actually make a difference on something or change something, it's amazing feeling for sure.
Right. Yeah. I think you mean you do a film because you want to express something. You didn't do the film to get a thank you, but it's kind of nice to get the thank you.
Exactly.
And if not for you,
I'm not talking about this film in particular. I think just general in art, or whatever.
Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about filmmaking with you for a second. I have a question about one choices you made and how you thought about that. So there are wonderful images in the film, evocative images. It ends with the boat on the water, obviously signaling back to the boat that didn't make it to Sweden. It has the boy walking through the kind of canopied forest towards the light with the backpack on, with the hat on. It has an image of a woman lying in a bed, or a shadow image of a woman meant to perhaps evoke Rebecca. It has a woman looking out to sea. But none of these are truly the family. These are all images you created. Did you debate with yourself, do I have this license? I'm making a documentary film, but I'm including here these images nobody could capture because nobody took them, but that I myself am imagining are reflective of the way the family was.
That's a really interesting question, actually, because I really thought a lot about those pictures, because I was very clear on from the start of it. I don't want to make like reenactments that say, then this happens, then this happens, and this happens. Because I don't know. I've heard these stories so many times, and the facts and details that change over time. So it's hard to say, exactly this happened. But what I can capture, though, is the emotion of it. So the emotion I get when these people are talking to me and expressing the stories. So I thought it would be more interesting to just create these more like poetic memory kind of photos in a sense, right? Of them, you know, the boy walking into this kind of light or coming back, and yeah, whatever it is. I think it was a sense more to like not entirely create, you know, a narrative. Then this happened, that this happened, but this is what I get out of it emotionally. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I can imagine some historians being upset, but I think you're absolutely, for me, they were very effective. And I think if movie making and art in general is the communication of emotion, this is why it's more important to an artist to have these things that you have to take a little creative license for, because this isn't a fact story. This is a story about feelings, the feelings you have, the feelings the family is struggling with. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I
And
think you have to
also,
help. You helped us with that, I think, by having these images.
well, thanks so much. And I think it underlines the subjectivity of my own, in a sense.
Great. That's true.
Because I really hope this is the case when people watch it, is that, you know, I don't have the answer. I still don't. And this is just me trying to look at it objectively as I can, but it is impossible. Like, there's no such thing. It can't be done from my side, you know?
Yeah.
So I hope that's apparent as well in the film.
I mean, if I could single out one, though, that was the one standout for me, partly because it's so of color, whereas the others to me are more the black and white variety and very haunting and evocative, is the reenactment. And this is the only one you actually say this is a reenactment of the squatting down on the near the railroad tracks coming out of the cattle car. It says Robert's reenactment, I think, on the screen. That one for me was jarring in a different way than the others were evocative. So do you see that of the same ilk? Why was that one important for you alongside the ones that you created in a way?
Because I think that particular one is like, you get the sense of how it affects Robert. It's not my, you know, diction of it. I just think it's, it was fascinating to see what kind of memories had struck Robert. What was it that he was, and I think this is actually, I don't think it's not included in the film, but what he talks about, that what the reason why he chose that picture to make the reconstruction that he makes was because he remembered when they had to deport them. They, you know, when they had to go out, they have to just go to the bathroom basically on the rails. And what the most awful thing about it was the Germans, the Nazis, who just laughed at them. That was the worst thing. It was not the fact that they had to go to the toilet. It was like the pure, like the thing about just not being humiliated in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And
He does mention it in the film.
Yeah.
And he also says that he's an inhibited type. This was probably difficult for him even to take advantage of.
Yeah, I think that story just struck me so much. Like, it had so much to say, and the feeling of all these things they go through. Yeah.
It's funny, you have a history of something called the Holocaust, which has moments that dwarf this in terms of outrageous horror. But in truth, perhaps moments like this are more accessible to the viewer because none of us will know what it's like, thank God, to be in a concentration camp. We don't know what cold hunger is or a selection is. All of this is hopefully foreign to most people, but you know what it might mean to be in a position of embarrassment. And I think in that way, I can understand why it would mean so much both to him and to you in the film. I wonder, where do I go? I want to go next to, let me go to this, what you've already hinted at. You, for the most part, are a listener. You're a watcher and a listener. You're wonderful how you ask questions and you don't give answers, and you try to, as you said, stay objective. But finally, towards the end, and I almost would say you're like a therapist and not a judge, but towards the end, you finally seem to have had it. And you push back at Robert and you start prosecuting him a little bit. You're finally contending with him about the hypocrisy, that he's saying, you know, he shouldn't judge us, and yet he's judging Mons as he says that. Had you maybe you'd done it before, but it seemed for me watching the arc of the film, you finally had it. You said, no, I'm going to push back.
Yeah, for sure. It was the last interview I did. So it was basically, I think, you know, I also have like, what do you call it in English? Like a threshold, or what you say, you know, like that was it, you know? Yeah. And I think I knew I was going to make that confrontation at some point. But I didn't want to affect him. I wanted like the purest answer So I think that was kind of on purpose that I, left that as late as I could, because what I think is interesting about that scene is, he wants my grandfather to see Fanny. So he sees Fanny, and that's still not good enough. There's nothing in the world my grandfather ever can do that, he would approve of. Like, even when he tries to make things better again, right? So I think that was kind of like part of the reason why. But also I think, like, when he says, you haven't understood it, I think, often I don't think he's right. I think there's something he doesn't understand. On the other hand, though, it must also be something I can't understand. I'll never be able to understand this conflict from their point of view, So I think it's an interesting, that scene is really interesting on so many levels. Yeah.
Don't you think he is righteously resentful? And he didn't do it to be thanked, but he was never taken care of. He tried to best he could as a 17-year-old to take care of literally everyone in the family. And then he is not good enough to be with anymore, as far as your grandfather is concerned. We can fault him for not having the imagination to understand how difficult it was for your grandfather, the youngest of the group, who went through all these traumas and now has found a way to vanquish the trauma by submerging it and finally finding this wonderful woman to live his life with, where he feels love for the first time. But Robert also, I think, deserves our sympathies for everything he did, and which is all thankless seemingly. And you could see him projecting, oh, I'm so upset that he doesn't even go to Fanny. He really is upset that he doesn't come to him.
Yeah,
he doesn't love him.
And that's why I when you talk about blame in the family, and now I'm not talking, and then think about obviously the Nazis and the whole history, but if you just think about the family, blame is a hard word to use, right? Because I think they all tried their best and it just didn't work out, in a sense, the constellation didn't work. So yeah, I completely agree.
I mean, it's interesting you say later, totally understandably, given what you've gone through in making this film, you on camera tell your family how much you love them, your parents, how much you love them, and don't want to ever have this happen inside the family. And you can feel finally you're saying, oh my, this is over. Thank God we are intact, my immediate family, my parents and I. But, what happened to your extended family was not something inherent in that family. What would that family have been had somebody not knocked on a door and broken them up and sent them in two different directions? So again, it feels like the blame and even the condition of this family is a byproduct of nothing about the family. I mean, everybody has to take responsibility, but about the actual perpetrators again. It again feels tragic that you have this sense. First of all, your grandfather says there's no love in this family. But he does follow that up by saying Hitler took it from them.
Exactly. And yeah, exactly. And like that, every person has contradictions, like, and that's especially true of this family. But I do think that's a pretty, like, that would be a log line for the film. There wasn't much love in the family. Hitler had taken it away. And like, that's almost even worse, right? Like, he stole the love. Like, it's such a powerful sentence. Yeah. And I do think that's kind of like the log line in a sense for the film.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's amazing that given how much he has tried to freeze that time in the past and not let it be part of him, that he has the insight that we're doing all this and not loving and not giving the love a family should give, not because of our own nature, but because of what the Nazis created in us.
Exactly, yeah. So he does, that's also a thing that we should like appreciate a bit, because like he does have that perspective. I mean, also there is this change at the end where he says, you have the truth lies within the four stories, Yes. So he does actually, even though he has so much to blame, he does acknowledge the fact that, I don't have all the answers. Like, and he actually said it was really interesting. He said, I'm looking forward to seeing it just as a film. Yeah.
No, he has wonderful insights that you've I mean, again, so many of the lines are precious that you've captured from all the family members. There's a beautiful line that Saleh explains to you the nature of why there are no flowers at the Jewish cemetery. Yeah. I think that's poetic, and it's true, of course, about why that is and why you put stones and not flowers. Going back to that encounter with Robert, though, I just have to admire, you are the prosecutor there. You're defending your grandfather. But then when they say, both of them, his wife and he, Robert, that you don't understand, you're too young, you don't push back. You let them say that. I can't imagine that you didn't feel, wait a second, don't pass this off, I'm too young. But I think as a viewer, I'm also saying, I don't understand, they don't understand. This is hard to understand.
Yeah, it is. And I think I'll live like, yeah. That's why there's so much interpretation in that one line. You haven't understood a single thing. It's something that's been going on in my mind ever since, really. Like, because you can interpret in so many ways, in a sense, for sure.
Some might argue we are all honor bound to not let anything close like this happen to us again, because we won't be able to understand it no matter how many times it happens. The only thing we can try to do is keep this impossible to understand event happen again, so we're not plagued in the midst of it, but the plague doesn't end. It continues afterwards, as your family struggle reveals.
Exactly, yeah. So true.
I want to go back to the interesting moment you have in the museum for a sec. I shared with you before we came on that I'd been to this museum. It's about the size of an apartment.
Yeah.
But it's a fantastic museum, and I recommend it to anyone who visits Copenhagen. But it's interesting in a kind of a symbolic way how careful you tell them first. And you mentioned the irony that this is your family's letters, but it's owned by the museum. But it doesn't seem like that bothers you. You just pointed out. But it made me think how careful you had to put on the gloves so you didn't harm the letters. And I'm just wondering if you were struck or can think about the irony that how much care we take of the letters and how little care we took of the people.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like it's I don't know how to answer that actually.
I mean, it was once done before recently with the Afghan situation where there was tremendous uproar over the statues, the Buddhist statues there, but nobody seemed to care that Afghan people were dying.
Yeah,
There's something
true,
about
actually.
us that doesn't seem to have the same care about people as we do about things.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. I did think about that. There's like a certain like amazing fascination about this that you kind of like forget. Well, what are they actually a product of, in a sense? For sure. Like there's a deep fascination, including myself, in a sense, right? They're locked away. Like it's a historical document to something, and that almost takes like so much focus of, and you kind of like forget about what the atrocities in a sense.
Right.
It's kind of weird. I never thought about it in that way, actually. That's a kind of.
I mean, the oddness is we're protecting something partly so we have this history, but had we protected the people, we wouldn't need to protect the letters. There would be no letters.
Yeah, for sure. And that gets even furthermore like emphasized that the fact that I have to wear gloves to get a hold of my own family members' letters. It's crazy.
I mean, it makes sense in the archivist's world because you can't touch them because they've been specially treated to make sure they are still in good shape. Yeah.
Also, this thing about I'm diving into like the secrets and the what's going on beneath all these things. So it's kind of like also metaphor for the story in a sense. Yeah.
So it sounds like you've given me this answer already, but have you solved the riddle that you began with? Have you found out why your father would not be with his family? And,
my grandfather.
And why the family is like it is? Why your grandfather, I'm sorry. Oh, actually, before you do that, let me just ask a quick question now that you brought up. So you mentioned Lars as your father's name, Lars. And at the end, you say how you love them. But Lars is nowhere to be seen in this film. He never even comes up in any of the family's words. Why is Lars totally absent? Other than you saying his name once and thanking your family.
Well, the thing is actually all of that generation's children are not included. But I did interviews with them, a lot of them actually, because that's a whole nother interesting story. How do they pass on the trauma to the second generation? That's another film, because that unravels so many other questions. So I think the reason why my father is not in it, and the reason why all the other children isn't in it, is because that's also such another fascinating story that just doesn't fit in with the story. I think I wanted it to be clear. This is about that conflict. That specific conflict in this family. But there are so many interesting things. Also, I think one of the amazing feedbacks I got was from the children. I think actually the emotional response from the children was even more like fascinating than the person themselves, because they also got some answers to some questions they never had before, because their childhood is also affected by their parents' childhood, right? So suddenly, there was like, I got so emotional responses. It was amazing. So they also got some peace. But definitely, like that's. I've also seen some really great documentary films about, that kind of like first generation, second generations, and what that could do. And that's also like one of the reasons why I'm able to do it, is because I'm third generation. We also already talked about this, but I'm like the innocent, naive grandchild, right? I don't have that conflict, that level of closeness in a sense.
But you still struggle. You struggle, and that's why you made
Yeah,
the
yeah,
film. This is still a riddle. So is this, getting back to where I was going to go until your father, by mistake said your father instead of grandfather. Have you gotten closer to the solution of the riddle? Have you solved the riddle? Does the riddle matter as much as it did when you started?
Okay, well, okay, it's gonna be kind of a different answer to this, but I can explain about this. At the end, you have, the truth lies within these 4 stories, and not from what I said. Originally, when I made this film and in the edit, I put that in the beginning. And at the end of the edit, I was like, no, this is the end actually. So I think I kind of, so in a sense, I didn't riddle it, but maybe I did again in a sense, because there's not a point where it was like, okay, this is the reason. It's like this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened, and all those things build up to the fact that my grandfather cut ties.
Yeah. You're a very good filmmaker. You're going to have a good career, I think. This is reminiscent of the whole point of the film Rashomon, the multiple perspectives to anything, and that the answer to what really happened is not in any one of them, but in the combination of all, or what's between them all. That's a beautiful answer. I love that answer.
So much.
So let me ask you one last question. And that's not a question. I don't want to imprison you with a question, so I'd love you to be able to say any thoughts or feelings or message that you'd like to say, knowing that this is the last question, and not be bound by anything I ask of you.
Well, actually, can I give an advice, actually? That would be a great thing. I was once told by a teacher that please interview your grandparents before it's too late. And like, you should really do that. And also maybe even do it with your parents. It's like they have so many great, amazing stories that you wouldn't know about. And there's not because like, that you as a person have bad intentions that you don't want to know these things. It's just a very unnatural thing to do. It's like, hey, can I get your story or whatever it is, So I think I've learned so much about that. And I'm actually a bit annoyed that I haven't done this with my other grandparents, because there's so much you don't know, and like, so many things you can discover. So it's like the best advice I've ever gotten, I think.
I think it's the best advice we all could get.
Yeah.
You've done a wonderful job of taking the baton from this teacher and taking it and giving it to us. I love this message. I love that you've made this film. I mean, it's so fantastic. Let me just say, you look very good with a kippah, with a yarmulke on at the funeral. I think without question, your parents, your grandparents, your extended family should all be proud of you for making this film, for caring about them, and for trying to right a wrong in a way. And I see a person who struggles and wonders and listens and does all these wonderful things that I don't want to say Jews have a monopoly on this, but I would say it's kind of Jewish. And maybe it's Jewish Christian, which some people would say is an oxymoron, but I leave that for people to say. I don't know that God feels the same way. I think it's a beautiful combination of the various things that make us beautifully human. And I think you've displayed that definitely for me in this interview. I love meeting you, but also in this wonderful film you've made. It's a gift. I will say Mangatak.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
So let me do some other thank yous here as well as we conclude this interview. I want to thank again you, Benjamin, for making this important film and for taking the time to give us a deeper understanding of your film and your family, and through that of the Holocaust and the continuing damage it has caused and the complexity of being human in this world. Truly. And once again, on behalf of the festival organizers, I wish to thank all the festival members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and especially the presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for their continued support of the festival throughout all these years. And to the other half of the equation, our audience, a film without viewers is like a tree falling in a forest that I think doesn't make a sound. It is thanks to your attending the festival that the sound and light of the film, in this case, this film, can complete its journey and they can be seen and heard. Thank you for participating in the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival. Mangatak, Toda Rabah, thank you very much.